Greetings. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and welcome to another Walk Magick video. In a recent video, while discussing how to command low spirits, the charge to the spirit from Magic in Theory and Practice, Crowley mentioned talismans in regard to evocation. Now, that made me think that instead of going into talismans then and pretty much just glossing over them, I should make an entire video on the subject, as it is worthy of much more time and effort than I could have given in that video. So without further ado, let's begin. In the 7th edition of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn by Israel Regardie, Book 7 has two pertinent chapters, Talismans and Talismans and Sigils. There we read the following definition, quote, "A talisman is a magical figure charged with the force which it is intended to represent. In the construction of a talisman, care should then be taken to make it, as far as is possible, so to represent the universal forces that it should be in exact harmony with those you wish to attract. And the more exact the symbolism, the more easy it is to attract that force. Other things coinciding, such as consecration at the right time, etc." End quote. So, back in the Magic in Theory and Practice video of the Charge to the Spirits by Crowley, when he mentions talismans, yes, this definition by Regardie is definitely what a talisman is. But if we look at the definition of magic as causing change to occur in conformity with will, the science and art of causing change, rather, a talisman on the mundane plane can be something as simple as a hairbrush, for instance, where every day you brush your hair for self-care, to make your hair more beautiful or handsome, whatever have you. That brush then becomes a Venusian talisman. So anything that you use habitually for a specific purpose with an intended goal, with will, becomes a talisman over time. Your handling it, your use of it, and your energy going into it over time charges that item. Because basically, we are all magicians. Every single day of every single person's life, when they make a decision to take an action, and that action has some type of intended outcome, whether that outcome comes to pass or not determines how good their magic was at that particular moment. And then take into account somebody who understands what their true will is and how many of their actions is geared towards performing their true will on a day-to-day basis for the entirety of their life. That also affects how good of a magician they are, whether all of those actions intended towards their true will come to pass. So you can make talismans along those lines, but in your mundane life, I don't want to get too far off the subject. This lecture in and of itself is basically going to focus on ritual magic type talismans, and we're going to be diving in along the lines of that definition by Israel Regardie. So I'm not going to go too much into mundane factors. I might use mundane things as examples at times, but really I'm talking about invoking forces, not just, like I said, using a hairbrush, or perhaps like a phone book is another good mundane example of a talisman. You have this handwritten book of people and phone numbers, so every time you wish to evoke a spirit for an intended purpose, you need to get your hair cut, so you call your barber to make sure that you have a slot or an appointment, or your salon or whatever, set up an appointment so you could get your hair cut. There's an intended goal there. You're taking an action. This book that you've written names and numbers in is your talisman to make sure that you can get your hair cut. So I might use examples, but I'm not going to focus on those type of things. So coming back to ritual magic and talismans, a talisman can range from a simple to complex drawing to any item chosen, made, or purchased, so long as it clearly represents that which you need it to do magically. It should be consecrated with proper invoked forces and be used like you would any tool. Let's use a mundane example once again to explain the idea. You want to evoke a certain feeling in your home, like comfort or relaxation. So you decide a painting of a beautiful field will help. you need to tack a nail into the wall, so you use a hammer. So the operation here consists of getting a hammer and nail, tacking it where you want this painting to be seen, and then finally hanging it up. The painting is your talisman, and the hammer and nail your magical weapons to perform the ritual of making your painting hang. It would not be good to get a painting of a burning building, nor to use a screwdriver in this scenario if you wish to evoke relaxation or put a nail into the wall. So the same thing goes for the ritual of making a talisman. Your invocations, magical weapons, and choice of item to become your talisman all need to be considered carefully to make the talisman work for the desired end that you need it. In a few moments, I will give several examples of talismans that I have made in the past and explain what I did to make them, what they're intended to do, and what my results were. But first, let's look back at the Golden Dawn book again. There are several warnings, and I will paraphrase them quickly. Do not use magic on someone without their permission. Only in rare cases is this okay, such as to save a life, but even then, it is better to know if the person will be okay with you interfering or not. Not to mention, you may be directly meddling with their karma. Next, be very careful using magic for mundane things. You run the risk of hampering your spiritual progress. If it is not your will to have something, but you aim to get it just to feed your ego, you are doing yourself a big disservice. Do not do love spells. Do not use talismans for love or to make somebody fall in love with you. I've said this numerous times. Be careful making a talisman for someone else, even if they ask you to do it. You'd first have to understand their karma and know that you are directly interfering in that capacity and causing your own karma out of their karma by connecting yourselves to them and their situations that they need to deal with. There are instances that this may not be the case, but as long as you are taking responsibility for all of that, it becomes a kind of gray zone. Crowley once wrote, "Don't go out of your way looking to help people who don't want your help, and be very cautious helping those who do request it." If you are practicing Rosicrucian-based traditions, such as Thelema, do not sell magic or teachings, and that includes talismans. Our aim is to help humanity evolve in their consciousness, and we do that through service and leadership, not monetary gain from them. From the Golden Dawn text, quote, "In cases where talismans and symbols have done their work, they should be carefully decharged and then destroyed. If this is not done, and you take a symbol, say of water, still charged, and throw it into the fire to get rid of it, you are inflicting intense torment on the elemental you have attracted, and it will react on you sooner or later. Also, if you throw away a still charged talisman, thus desecrating it, it will become the property of other things, which, through it, will be enabled to get at you. It is for these reasons that the talisman should be decharged with the pentagram and hexagram, according as it partakes of the planetary or zodiacal nature." End quote. Now, with all of that said, I want to give a few examples of talismans that I have made, followed by clear instructions of how you can make one. Going back to 2013, when I first heard of Thelema, was beginning my studies of Wicca after going through as many traditions as were accessible to me in state prison. Let me paint a picture of the environment I was in, as that dictated my first two talismans made at similar time. I mostly got along with everyone, but in prison, even if you get along with everyone, you never know when someone is going to have a bad day and bump heads with you. Besides that, I did my best to stay to myself and either write in my journal, read, or meditate. Sometimes I'd work out. In fact, when I first went in, I worked out a lot, and as I knew I was coming home, I kind of focused more on my studies. So that was how I spent my days. Once in a while, I'd have a few conversations with people, but the environment is very noisy, and the things being shouted across the dormitory, even though people are right next to each other, tends to be very loud, and if someone is looking for drama to entertain them, they egg someone on to start a problem with someone else for no reason other than to pass time. This is a crude picture, but I think it's enough to set the stage. I had very few problems with people, but when I did get into conflicts, they always came very unexpectedly in the spur of the moment and had to be dealt with fast thinking and choosing the right words to defuse the situation. So after studying as many occult books as I could get my hands on at the time, I made my very first talisman. It was simple, a piece of paper with a thick 7-point star drawn upon it. In the triangles near the points, I chose a 7-lettered word in Theban script. Around the septagram on the outside, I wrote words of protection. Unfortunately, I don't remember what these words were. I prayed over the talisman and saw light in my aura extend upon the paper drawn down from the highest, and enlighten the paper so that it glowed to my eyes. This was simple, and yet very effective. I used a stapler to tack it up on my cubicle's corkboard, and that was it. The result: people stayed away. Once or twice, people who I knew were problem starters got close to my cubicle, but I saw them look from the corner of their eye at the talisman, and whether superstitious thinking pushed them away, fear, or if it was just an unconscious response, I don't know, but they left pretty much immediately. After hanging that up, I didn't have a single problem with anyone. A trans woman was in our prison and also came to our Wiccan group. People constantly picked on her and were always looking to egg on a fight or just verbally abuse her. So she talked to me at one of our Wiccan meetings about it, and I told her about my talisman. She decided she would make a similar one. She hung it up, and we were sharing a dormitory at the time, and I actually heard people in our dormitory talking about the talisman, and that though they disliked her, they didn't want to be hexed, and so she was basically off limits, and they were no longer going to mess with her. So hearing that made me really happy that I was able to make my own thing and then share it with somebody that was constantly picked on and abused, and it worked quite well for them. My second talisman was a little more advanced, though from my point of view today it was still rather simplistic and crude. You'll see it on your screen now. A friend had given me a 4-leaf clover they found in the prison yard. I decided to use it for this talisman. I got my hands on a piece of thick paperboard. I cut a 2-inch square, and on the back wrote in Hebrew, Chakma, which is Hebrew for wisdom. On the front, I drew a personalized sigil, which I had recently made to symbolize my great work. A symbol I am still rather fond of, which you can also see on your screen now. It consists of an eye of the triangle on a flat plane, much like a pyramid in the Egyptian desert. On the flat plane, right and left of the pyramid, are the Hebrew letters Gimel and Yod, together forming the word Gaia, the Greek titan and goddess of earth. Yod is the fire of Tetragrammaton and corresponds with Virgo, the hermit card of Tarot, indicating the wizened mage and magus. Gimel corresponds with the moon, the unconscious realms. Above the pyramids are a pentagram and hexagram in circles, symbolizing loosely the sun and moon as the great lights, but also the microcosm and macrocosm. Lastly, as I was in prison without access to a laminating machine, I used packing tape to seal and protect the soon-to-be talisman, also sticking the 4-leaf clover on the back under the word Chakma, using that tape to help seal it. The purpose of this talisman was twofold: to bring me wisdom and luck on my path performing the great work. I prayed over the talisman, invoking and charging it with the divine light, and finally I invoked Tahuti with crude rudimentary prayers I'd crafted myself, and he laid his hands upon the talisman through my hands and charged it with the intents to help me gain wisdom and luck in performing the great work which I had just begun. To use it, it merely needed to exist in my general vicinity. It would work on the forces around me to help me find the right books and people to talk to that would help me along in my path, as well as to discover the right practices at that time and help me begin to understand the Hermetic Kabbalah, which was new to me and was somewhat overwhelming. Considering now how far I've come since that point over a decade ago, I'd say it worked very well. I still have it in my possession and have yet to decharge it, as I believe we always have room to grow, and if it can help me even now in my current phase of the great work, all good and well. Another example I can give, I made in 2018. I was tight on cash, needed many books and magical weapons. Not to mention I had begun dating my current fiancé and was not working, so my funds were low. I know my will, and that dating this man was definitely in conformity with it, and having him as a partner is definitely part of my great work. So I decided to make a talisman to bring me cash. And I knew good and well at that time, money spells are not free money, and karmically I was creating a debt. I accepted full responsibility for that fact. Over the next 6 months, I suddenly got a ton of odd jobs, won several lottery tickets, and found cash frequently in random ways. I made about $25,000 through such events in a very short time. My library blossomed, and I had no limit of cash for about 8 to 10 months. But the day came when I moved in with my fiance that I needed money with, as I had deactivated the talisman, and so I grounded myself, selling over 75% of the library as a way of repaying that karmic debt. I knew that those books were borrowed with that money, they were not free. Still, I considered this talisman an absolute success. What it was a $1 bill folded into a triangle which retained its shape. So it was basically an origami triangle so that you could pick it up and it wasn't going to unfold. Basically, and the words were right side up on the cup, so it was very interesting. So it was for money to come in. I drew on it a symbol of Jupiter with sexual fluids after invoking Jupiter through a magical square and the Orphic hymn to Jupiter. Again, simple, yet effective. Now, I want to discuss how you can make your own talisman, keeping in mind the warnings and parameters I opened this video talking about. I highly recommend a book called Making Talisman by Nick Farrell. He gives full detail in choosing implements, constructing appropriate temples, and all the details about how a talisman works, how to consecrate and activate them, and how to double check your work. One interesting chapter is about utilizing angels to make a talisman. He corresponds the angels and their choirs with either planet, zodiac, or Sephiroth. He details exactly how to harness their energy to infuse it into an item, turning it into a functioning talisman. As long as you know how to invoke specific forces, say planetary or god forms, and can manipulate the astral light of that invoked force, directing it into the talisman by will and visual methods, you are ready to make a talisman. So to do this, you want to open your ritual space with the LBRP, LBRH, and the invoking form of those rituals, or else the Star Ruby and Star Sapphire. If you opt for the LBRP, LBRH, and then the invoking pentagram and hexagram castings, you can then use the greater pentagram and hexagram rituals based on what type of energy you are planning on invoking. You then want to purify and consecrate your space, as well as the soon-to-be talisman. For that, you could go to my videos on purification and consecration. You can use salt water and specific types of incense. I'll get more into that in a moment, but there are those two passages from the Book of the Law. For pure will, unassuaged the purpose, delivered from the lesser result is every way perfect, as you're using the salt water. And I'm uplifted in thine heart, and the kiss of the stars rain hard upon thy body, as you're using the incense to consecrate. Of course, before you begin this ritual, you want to already have picked out the item to be made a talisman based on what you need it to do. This is a deep consideration, and if you're making a drawing on something, you should do this in its own separate mini ritual, previously inside a magical circle, and then wrap it in a corresponding color of silk before storing it away until you're ready to make it a functioning talisman. You may even do this and then the next operation on the day and in the hour of the planet most closely associated with your intended function of the item. For love, Venus; for base material matters, Saturn; for luck or money, Jupiter, etc. Within your circle is anything you need for your ritual. This can be as simple as magical oils and incense, plus salt water for your purifications and consecration. Or you could go with an elaborate setup with various weapons and imagery and a full temple design, whatever you'd like. But don't overdo it, and do not have anything there that is not absolutely needed. Then you make your prayers and invocations of the necessary forces. Say for mercurial consecrations, I usually opt for Libra Israfel, changing line 17, quote, a pause, unquote, which is usually meant for communication, to a space where I can anoint the weapon or use sex magic. As a side note, you may consider using magical squares. If you don't know how to use that, perhaps I'll give a video about magical squares, but there are different squares, either the planetary ones or from the book of Abramelin the Mage, or perhaps you can make your own magical squares. They could have letters or numbers, inside of them, and it's a big subject, but you're basically going to use certain portions of those squares, their letters or numbers. You could draw sigils out of them. So there's a lot of things you could do in magical squares, but also consider whether or not you know how to do that, or if you want to do that when making a talisman and invoking a certain type of force. You could even have a magical square become a talisman by consecrating it with, blood or oil or what have you, and invoking the right forces into it with the proper intentions. When you get to the point of consecrating and activating the talisman, you could do a ton of different things. You may activate and visualize the corresponding planetary Sephiroth on your body, and then extend light from that sphere to imbue the talisman. You may opt for the heart or third eye to do this. So, let's say you're working with a solar type talisman. You could especially visualize Tiferet in your heart, a gold, brilliant gold, or even gold tinged pink light floating in your heart center as a sphere. And once you have that fully activated, you could send a beam of that golden light directly from that sphere into the talisman, connecting yourself to it and imbuing it with solar energy. You may use holy oils to draw some sigil or symbols on the talisman, or you might even use sexual fluids or blood. You may carve words into it. You may invoke a deity and have that deity imbue the talisman with its powers to make the talisman function. Again, it's all up to where you are at that moment as a magician. You may make simple steps, Solomonic style, or full-on dramatic ritual, creating a story of how the talisman is to function, why it must function, and writing in some powerful climax through a story that activates the talisman, which you'll act out in your ritual, something like Parsifal and the Lance in style. Now, after you are done, I recommend sealing the talisman in the appropriate color silk, once again, until you are going to use it. Note, if your talisman is, say, a magical square from the Book of Abramelin, you may keep it on your person or in a specific designated place where it will function until you deactivate it. Note that if you're going to be doing banishing rituals, you need to keep that thing sealed away, perhaps in silk, or I usually opt for black silk a lot of times, representing Bina and Nuit, as creating a whole microverse that no external thing can affect whatever's wrapped inside of there, and sometimes even putting binding spells upon it that I then take off when I'm going to open it to take the talisman out. That usually protects it from banishing rituals. If you don't want to make a talisman, then banish, it's just going to deactivate your talisman pretty much immediately. And also, as part of the consecration, you may make a sigil prior to your ritual and draw the sigil or symbol on the magic square in holy oil, blood, or sexual fluids, whatever you prefer. After you're finished with this talisman and no longer want it to function, you should decharge it. This can be as simple as having it on a small altar before you as you are doing banishings of the pentagram and hexagram rituals. You might even draw a fifth earth banishing pentagram in astrolite directly over the talisman as part of your LBRP to decharge it. Or again, you may make prayers and incantations, or a more complex dramatic ritual that is focused solely upon deactivating the talisman, returning it to simple base matter before disposing of it. Keep in mind, anything can be made into a talisman, whether it is a clock related to magic of time, or an article of clothing which when worn works some type of magic. The sky is the limit. Here I will reiterate the process of making a talisman from Rigardi's Golden Dawn book. Quote, having made a magical talisman, you should use some form of charging and consecrating it which is suitable to the operation. There are certain words and letters which are to be invoked in the charging of a tablet, the letters governing the sign under which the operation falls, together with the planet associated therewith, if it's a planetary talisman. Thus, in elemental operations, you take the letters of the appropriate zodiacal triplicity, adding L thereto, thus forming an angelic name, which is the expression of the force. Hebrew names, as a rule, represent the operation of certain general forces, while the names on the Enochian or angelic tablets represent a species of more particular ideas. Both classes of names should be used in these operations. After preparing the room in a way laid down for the consecration of lesser magical implements, supposing this to be an elemental talisman, first formulate towards the four quarters the supreme ritual of the pentagram as taught. Then invoke the divine names, turning towards the quarter of the element. Let the adeptus then, being seated or standing before the tablet, and looking in the requisite direction of the force which he wishes to invoke, take several deep inspirations, close the eyes, and holding the breath, mentally pronounce the letters of the forces invoked. Let this be done several times as you breathe upon the tablet, pronouncing them in a vibratory manner. Then, rising, make the sign of the rose cross over the tablet, and repeating the requisite formula, first describe round the talisman a circle with the appropriate magical implement, and then make the invoking pentagrams 5 times over it, as if the pentagram stood upright upon it, repeating the letters of the triplicity involved with the L added. Then, solemnly, read any invocation required, making the proper signs from the rose as you pronounce the names. The first operation is to initiate a whirl from yourself. The second, to attract the force in the atmosphere into the vortex you have formulated. Then, read the elemental prayer as in the rituals, and close with the signs of the circle and the cross, which is the rose cross, after performing the necessary banishing. Be careful, however, not to banish over the newly consecrated talisman, as that would simply decharge it again and render it useless. Before banishing, you should wrap the charged talisman in clean, white silk or linen." End quote. So I hope that you found this helpful. I hope you decide to make talismans for part of your great work and your spiritual development. And I'll see y'all in the next one. Love is the law. Love under will.